Every culture has one primary goal above all else: to maintain the status quo. Sometimes the status quo is reasonable, sometimes it's a little bit hokey, sometimes it's pathologically insane. But as long as everyone's doing it and has been doing it for a while, whether it's cutting the foreskin off of men's penises or slavery or any other form of both sanity or insanity, we feel comfortable because it's normal. And in order to maintain these norms, particularly in the face of vast amounts of scientific evidence, we have to involve a defense. And so every cult, every culture has a series of defenses. And dealing with truth whistleblowers, etc., is no exception. So let's look at our cult's defenses and where you may be in the defense pattern. So number one is, I don't have the time. So this is a myth that is very popular in America. Everyone's had the same 24 hours a day throughout recorded history. But Americans do tend to pack that 24 hours a day into 4 to 8 hours of television, statistically speaking. And of course, there's so many things to view on YouTube and otherwise. There's so many activities to rush around and do. And so one can legitimately say that one does not have time to do all of it. However, in this addictive, frenetic avoidance of responsibility for our own time, one of the things that we see is this penny wise, pound foolish type of principle, where we pretend that we don't have time to prevent any number of major catastrophes in our lives, and then suddenly come up with all the time that we need to solve the emergency our stupidity created. So we don't have time and money to shore up the dikes, but we have endless money to blame and do studies and fix, the wreckage from Hurricane Katrina. We don't have time and money to prevent going bankrupt, but we can crawl out of that and spend countless thousands of hours, recovering and getting back on our feet over the next 10 years. We do not understand that if we don't have time to talk about a pregnancy before it's here, we certainly don't have time to raise a child. But that's yet another example of our cult ignorance. So if you do not have time to do something to stop rape, abuse, trauma, to learn something about shame and public responsibility in these areas, you certainly don't have time to pick up the life of a sibling, of a mother, of a brother who collapses because you do not know what you're doing, because the cult around you doesn't know what it's doing. And it requires 4 years to rehabilitate someone induced into PTSD and trauma and sexual abuses. You don't have time not to do it. One of my ex-girlfriends said she didn't have enough money to buy pregnancy pills. And sure enough, she didn't. As she got pregnant with her next boyfriend, where does she get the money to raise a child? So this penny-wise, pound-foolishness doesn't hold up at all. If you don't have time to learn about trauma, the last thing you have time for is to go through a deep traumatic episode. So by all means, learn about these dynamics and help to create a safer community. The next thing is, of course, it's not my problem. A favorite amongst Americans, I didn't do it, it's not my problem. The trouble is the data suggests otherwise. Emotions are viruses. Trauma is a virus. violence is a virus. Gary Slutkin, an epidemiologist who gave a great TED Talk, talked about his transference from his expertise of studying epidemics in third world countries to studying and managing the epidemics of violence in the United States. It turns out that the best way to predict where the next outbreak of violence will occur is where the last one took place. So if you want to respond effectively to violence, treat it as a disease. Treat it as a disease and respond to it with a kind of medical protocol that can actually stop the spread of violence from becoming an epidemic. And so if it isn't your problem, or your problem, or your problem, or your problem, and you're in a traumatically illiterate cult, a relationally illiterate cult, an emotionally illiterate cult, do you realize that many of us do not know the definition or the difference between feelings and emotions? And if we think we know the difference between feelings and emotions, a large number of people don't agree with that definition. We're dealing with a profound level of emotional illiteracy, of psychic illiteracy. The psyche is one of the most sophisticated presences on the planet. And most of us do not have even a common approach to dealing with it, let alone a paradigm capable of understanding and respecting and honoring all parts of the psyche, let alone practice in doing so. It doesn't work to say that in an ecological system in which we virally influence each other in this emotional life, a PBS series explores the accident. That's how emotional studies get done in the US. It's by accident because chauvinistic cultures don't study emotions. The accident of studying the viral nature of feelings. That one's proximity to a feeling determines how likely one is to catch either the pleasure or the dis-ease of that feeling. And so it is our problem. Another defense is, I don't know what I'm doing. And that's very healthy. It's a good starting point. And the responsibility, your ability and perhaps willingness to respond is to learn more. And so I would invite you to study a little bit of the 1,000 or so hours of very important literature. Unlike trigonometry, unlike algebra, unlike many of the in one ear, out the other ear subjects that you endured in high school and college, the study of relationships, which determines 75% of a person's income and more than 40% of a person's human well-being over the course of a lifetime, is useful on a daily basis. The more you learn, the more you understand you can learn, the more intelligent you become in this domain, the more you prioritize this domain, because the yields are so high relative to video games or the various pastimes of the American cult. So it is your concern. If you don't have time to study and respond and prevent the disease, you certainly don't have time to encounter it. And another thing is, well, I don't know you. You're not part of my little clique. Well, diseases don't work that way. It's mathematically unsound to say that, I'm going to give medicine to these people. But these people, they can get the disease and start spreading it around because I don't care about them. They're not a special friend. Disease doesn't care who your friends are. Disease doesn't care who you think is cool. Disease is truly blind like Lady Justice in our social ideal. Disease doesn't care if you're rich or poor, black or white, tall or short, good-looking, ugly, fat or thin. Disease doesn't care about your dogmas and religion. It's just looking for a host body to establish itself and then spread. And if you're too bigoted to know that, because it doesn't occur to you to protect the people that are not cool in whatever your clique defines as cool, the disease is here to teach you a lesson, to teach you what treating a human being like a human being really is, because the disease doesn't care. It is just as grateful to establish itself in the throat of a homeless heroin addict that's been running from the horrors of Vietnam for the last 20 years. The disease will take whatever we offer up as a species. And the more vulnerable, the more shame-based, the more derelict, the more beaten, the colder, the more malnourished, the happier the disease is. And this is how diseases spread. Bigoted human beings protect the powerful cliques, elites, etc., but hand over their minorities and their vulnerable, their poor, whatever it is that's low-ranking. They hand these over to trauma, to one virus after another, and pretty much ignore it. Reagan ignored HIV and AIDS as long as it was in the gay community. And the disease says, thank you very much for the sacrificial bodies of your poorly treated species. We don't care what your income is. We'll take anyone. And establishes a foothold and then spreads. The same is true with emotional viruses. The same is true with mental viruses. We will take a foothold and then spread from there. So if you care about anyone in your life, care about the most vulnerable people who are becoming carriers to the disease because there's no support in the community for dealing with it. And there are carriers of sexual abuse who have been abused and abused and abused and now think that that's the way to treat people. There are carriers of trauma. There are carriers of rage. There are carriers of worthlessness and hopelessness. And they will transmit the diseases they carry until a force equal or greater confronts, contains, and heals the disease. This requires new technology, and that's what this project is about, exploring how can a small group of intelligent people do something differently rather than continue the explosion of mental, emotional, physical, and financial dis-ease that ripples out throughout our culture, affecting all of us.